Hey, Miles.
Heather,
Hello.
hello.
I'm so excited to actually have the opportunity to do this with you and to talk about, kind of right off the bat, one of the things that was the first thing that I think that drew me to you as a teacher. When I first heard you speaking about karma, I remember thinking like, oh, I actually really believe this person. This actually really speaks to my experience. And as I've been working with you over the years, through the Contemplative Studies program, most recently, I really am loving the way that you're taking all of these pieces and putting together, karma, along with how it's an expression of, really the Four Noble Truths, and then how that feeds into the Eightfold Path. And as I've been thinking about this a lot, over the past couple of months, as we've been in this program in particular, the thing that's really kind of striking for me is also something that comes from your book, Gradual Awakening, when you're talking about your own teacher, Godwin, one of your first teachers, when he talks about the only way out is through. That feels so like such an important piece of it, but at the same time, such a painful piece, right? And when we look at this idea of, you break it down as, view and intention and action, or just getting at these little micro steps. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what is it in the first place that informs this view that we hold, that kind of sets this whole thing in motion, this whole wheel in motion?
Well, first, let me thank you, Heather, because I've enjoyed being, pushed by you and encouraged by you for so many years now. I always see you as someone who's really so committed and excited about the Dharma. You're like a fellow Dharma geek, so it's always really nice for me to always sort of be in dialogue with people who are so fascinated by the Dharma and really want to get down to the nitty gritty, and so that's always inspiring for me. As far as view is concerned, I mean, I think we take for granted that view is the basis out of which we see the entire world. I mean, I think unless you come into contact with a word like view, you don't really think about it. We take it for granted that how we see the world is just how we see it, but that's actually not true. I mean, how we see the world has been conditioned by so many variables and so many factors, but essentially we're all holding a kind of unconscious belief about the world. And for example, the most pervasive sort of form of worldview is that right now is dominated by materialism, that, the world is essentially only a one-dimensional kind of space made of matter, and really everything else that is considered kind of metaphysical is hocus pocus. And so we've adopted that kind of scientific reductionism, and in a way it makes perfect sense because we live in a sense field where we like to pick up objects, but we're very, very skeptical about anything non-material. And that includes some of the most important things like consciousness or spirit. And I think just having that unconscious worldview really sets us at a disadvantage, because it means that so many really important factors about being a human being are dismissed. We're essentially just skin bags or meat bags, and we're sort of going through life having a collection of pleasant experiences with a kind of vision that is only very temporal, and at death we're going to basically disappear. That is the worldview that most of us have in a way been indoctrinated into. And so how worldview then conditions or colors your intentions and your actions. Well, if you've only got one life to live and it's all about your urges and there really is no consequence to anything, then just look around. If 8 billion people live that way, we're going to gobble up the resources, we'll marshal a defensive position against others who threaten or challenge us, and we're really not going to take care of the planet. And really there's no basis or reason to justify why we should take care of something like consciousness or evolution for that matter. We're basically just so much embedded in the body and here and now and the primitive instincts. And so that's how worldview affects your intentionality and your actions, but also how actions then come home to roost in a way, because we become the recipients of our own activity. And that's how, if you live on a planet where the ice caps are melting, it's sort of, we're complicit in that. And how are we complicit at the most fundamental level is our basic view of the world, our basic belief about the world, and a basic belief about who we are.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I feel like there's almost like this co-emergent quality that happens for me, you know, as someone who is interested in the path and who's on the path. There's this co-emergent quality of both confusion, you know, or this misperception, and also wisdom in a way, you know, that, and so in a lot of ways, sometimes I get confused when I go along with working with some of this material. I'm like, which part of, how do I trust the part of me that knows as I'm going along this? Do you know what I mean? You know, if at the hub of that wheel, you have that fundamental ignorance, right? The pig, you know, and then you have the snake and the rooster, right? You know, you have that sort of attachment and pushing away, right? We have that whole little wheel spinning. Sometimes I'm like, what's underneath the wheel? Is there anything underneath the wheel that it knows? You know what I mean? Like, what is the wheel sitting on? You know, is it sitting on confusion? Is it sitting on primordial wisdom? Like, what is it sitting on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the wheel is sitting within primordial wisdom. According to the later schools of Buddhism, there's a kind of what we would call Buddha nature. Buddha nature is sort of the natural condition of things, and yet the natural condition of things, since according to beginningless time psychology, the natural condition of things becomes obscured. So there's these very lovely metaphors like a sky that's naturally pristine and clear, and because it's clear and naturally pristine, it can accept all the weather conditions. It can be bright and sunny, it can be cloudy, it can be stormy, and it can change. And essentially, if you live in a part of the world where mostly you get clouds and rain, you start to think that you are the clouds and the rain, like people in England, for example. But
Portland, Oregon,
or Seattle and the West Coast, exactly. But very few people take a big step back and go, well, what about and put it together that the nature of the sky allows for the various weather patterns, and the nature of mind, according to Buddhist psychology, is naturally open, and therefore it can be conditioned to be greedy and stingy and violent, but it can also be conditioned to be loving and kind, and it can then also turn its own awareness on itself and discover its very nature, and then we're talking about a different kind of game, because once one discovers one's very nature, then one almost returns to one's source. And that's this is, you know, the metaphor of returning to one's source is found through all kinds of mythologies. It's you know, it is, you know, can be viewed as heaven. It can be viewed as enlightenment. All the big destinations, so to speak, are not out there, but they're right here, right now, apparently. And that's a really amazing thing, that they're right here, right now. And where and how is it that they could be anywhere else, really? Because if it were out here, I mean, if it were only a special few, then most of us would be left out. But the fact that from a Buddhist point of view, they're saying that the very nature of each and every one of our minds is naturally free, means that at any moment it can be accessed and realized. And during our course, I think you recall, like, most of us are temperamental, we're freaked out, we're really stressed out, but every single one of us at some moment, even if it's fleeting, can drop into a space where that stress, that trauma, that reactivity isn't there. Right. And so what is that space? How is that produced? How is it created? Well, if you look at it with any sort of precision, you can see that it's not created. It's just there. it's almost there between the gaps. It's almost there between the spasms. It's almost there between the twirls. It's almost there between the pangs. And we forget that. And so when you can taste it for a second, and then you put your thinking cap on and you go, no, this is a glimpse of my nature, then it can be very, very powerful and very, very motivating. And I think also it can destigmatize this kind of shame, sinner syndrome that is a leftover from monotheistic traditions where we were sort of born in sin. And the Buddhist psychology is telling us something quite very promising and very optimistic, which is, no, our nature is free. We just have a lot of, garbage between our ears and a warped perspective, but our natures are clear and ever available. Wow. I mean, that's very promising. And you don't have to, it doesn't do any good to believe it. I mean, when you were sitting in that class, all of us, all the students, when you go sort of resting in one's nature, you can catch a glimpse right here and right now with not much training. And also the external circumstances don't have to be right. It doesn't have to be beautiful out. You don't have to be on a pilgrimage. You don't have to be on the beach in I don't know where in Mexico. Right here, right now, you can taste it, and boom, that's entry into your very nature. So that's what all the poisons is obscuring, and because we wake up every day feeling stressed and feeling the constriction of our habituated tendencies, we have just become so used to them as being us and our condition that whenever anybody says, well, your nature is free, it actually feels pretty far-fetched. But for some of us who have been around the block and we've had these little glimmers, it's highly motivating because we want to begin to live in those places in our nervous system. So,
yeah, and it seems like something that I notice is, I mean, there are these two places, right? There's this place where we're holding, and watching. I mean, I know you've talked about this, like this holding space where you feel like you have that stability of mind, right? You have that concentration or that stability of mind, and that wisdom is arising. But at the same time, I feel like I'm almost watching sometimes like I'll have a feeling of love or warmth or friendliness or what you might call metta. And I can almost see, almost like a cloud rolling in, the desirous attachment, or the grasping, and it's so painful. It's almost like it feels unpreventable in some ways. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting, this idea of, we use this word sometimes, transcendence, right? Or in our class, we talked about nirvana, right? And the blowing out of some of that confusion, right? The blowing out of the kleshas and the blowing out of this idea that we are somehow completely separate and there's something to hold on to. I think it's just, I'm really interested in this, and I'm not even sure how to ask it, but in this idea of transcendence, not so much as a way out, but a path through. And when we start to get into the action part of how karma is created, I think I'm just curious about that and what you have to say about that.
Well, let me just ask you, Heather, from your own, because you've been doing this for a while. What do you think?
What do I think?
Because you're talking about love,
right?
And you're also talking about confusion and habits getting in the way. But you've been doing this for so long. So how are you navigating your way through this? I mean, I think you are just like a lot of us. Mm-hmm. You've sort of put your time on the cushion. You've done lots of yoga. You really, these high ideals really appeal to you. And yet we have families, we have jobs, we have incomes to make, we have, this and that getting in our way. So how are you sort of putting it all together and making your way through?
I think for me, it's, I'm coming to realize as I go on that I really have been secretly hoping to kind of bypass some of those things, that deep down, I'm just like, oh, and when I finally figure it out, I actually won't get so attached, or I won't. But what I'm realizing more and more is that I have to be in the muck of life, that it has to be, that if my consciousness is created relationally, that I have to work it out relationally. that I have to be okay with actually having these kleshas, or these icky things that I don't really want, or these wonderful things. I mean, like, I love being in desire, and at the same time, it's like, oh, it's so there's so much, so much that comes from that. So I think it's almost like offering myself the okayness, or the friendliness to like that my mind is able to accommodate all of that.
I love it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm hearing a sense of permission that is probably born out of a lot of disillusionment. In other words, once we get into the spiritual world and we start doing our time because we're really deeply motivated, we're looking to get out.
Yeah.
We're looking to get out of strife, out of stress, out of pain. We want answers, and we don't want any more pain. We want freedom.
Right.
And who wouldn't? I mean, that's down to the cellular level. But I think if you do this work long enough, you start to either fall into a category where you feel like you're doing something wrong because what has been promised isn't happening for you. So guess what? You're not sitting long enough. You haven't understood the philosophy, or something else happens, which you lose some of your naivete about the spiritual world, that it's really a kind of dichotomy. We're stuck over here, but there's a freedom over there. And I haven't been able to taste it, or I haven't been able to arrive. I'm still on the path. And I think I really appreciate that, because I mean, I'm still working this out for myself, and I'm still very much suffering. But what is lessening for me are the naive notions that there's a kind of rainbow effect when you're doing your practice right. Like you always feel good, or you're always up or always high if you're doing it right. And as someone with 2 kids and a job and living in the world, I mean, I think that that's just preposterous. I mean, these things of up and down, high and low, good and bad, they come together. I mean, you can't have one without the other. And the promise that you can have one without the other is a kind of, I think it's sort of snake oil. And I think a spiritual life in the world requires us to mature to a sensibility of accepting that challenges are inevitable. I mean, really, when the Buddha is talking about the first noble truth, he's really saying that you can't get around this, folks. If you're embodied and you're living in the world, it is very, very painful and difficult already. Yeah. Already. But then, I mean, so that's a huge pill to swallow, because most of us are going like, well, this is the way out. But the way through requires you to kind of grow up. No, it's hard, and you can't get around that. It's hard. Now, what's the bit that we can work on is all the other stuff we ascribe to the fact that it's hard, the fact that we resist, the fact that we push it away, the fact that we don't want it, the fact that those are our imputations on an already difficult, challenging life. Mm-hmm. So I think the mature kind of spiritual person that you've grown to be, and that I'm growing to be, is the haze of the childish naivete is begin to lessen. And that doesn't mean that we're just now stoic. It means that there's a deeper kind of knowing, a deeper kind of acceptance. It means that we're willing to work with the challenges. We're willing to go through some of the shit. And that is itself the path. That's the path right there, not some other path through the terrain where it's smooth, these cobblestones that are nice and smooth, and the trail is augmented by beautiful flowers, and it goes through, the valley and into the sunset. I mean, come on, get real. Like both of us have kids, and most of our friends and peers and students all have kids and families and live in the world. And guess what? It's bumpy, and I can't catch myself all the time going, when is this going to even out? And guess what the answer is? Life doesn't even itself out. You just have to get better at riding it. And part of getting better at riding it, I think, is those moments of realization where you and I come to, and we're like, oh yeah, this is how it is. Right. This is how it is. So what are we going to do? Right.
And it's so interesting because there are those 2 places, along that wheel that feel like they have gaps. There's like a very obvious gap, and then there's a more subtle gap as well, right? There's that space between like the urge and the action, which, like, when I work with middle school students, and when I'm working with them, I'll talk with them about, like, you can have all of this happen. You can have your view of the way things are going, and, you can have emotions come up, and then you have this, like, oh, I really want to do this, and it's very obvious to them. And it's actually not always so obvious to them, because they're in that impulse control stage a little bit, where they're like, oh, wow, you mean I can actually intervene in that space between having this feeling and acting, that there's a space. But I think what's really been blowing me away lately is that other gap that we really talk about more in the program, which is that after a while, when you get really good at cleaning up your action or acting differently, that the urge part starts to change. That the urge starts to, and that's been really interesting for me to experience in relationship, to sit with someone that I can feel fondness for and be like, wow, I actually don't. I'm feeling fondness, and that's all. Or when something triggers me, that it's not the same old set of reactions anymore. So I think I think that's something that's really been interesting.
Yeah, I love that, because I think, again, there's a maturity that's happening. I think when we talk about karma, we're talking about how thoughts or perceptions feed emotions and impulses, and those impulses, like a domino effect, create actions, and those actions just don't disappear. They actually have a ramification on our own consciousness. So everything matters. So this is what we're talking about with karma. And most of us know that if we feel hurt by someone, then we'll feel anger, and then the urge to retaliate is almost like a natural domino response. And then you might, send a nasty email or whatever. And most of us know about that. We know about that viscerally, in the mind and body being conditioned so that it's almost like a knee jerk. And then you come into the spiritual world and you start to meditate, and you start to get some impulse control, which children are having, they're in the beginning stages of really learning this impulse control. And adults, we're just children in bigger bodies, so we still have our own impulse control. But with some attentional training, i.e. meditation, then there becomes the opportunity to slow down the domino effect enough to tolerate the urge to retaliate, but resist the active action phase. Okay, and so you don't put out any more bad karma, but inside you're still wanting to hit send on the iPhone on your message, your nasty message. But that's restraint, that's self-discipline, and that self-discipline prevents that sort of full effect of karmic retaliation or retribution to take place on your consciousness. But what you're talking about is people start asking questions, what about that urge? What about that anger? What about that resentment? Okay, and I say, this is one of the maturing things, is in the moment, could you have done anything about that anger? And it's a trick question on your quiz. In a way, there's nothing you can do about the anger. If someone bumps you the wrong way or sends a nasty email or something like that, and you have a moment of anger like that, is there anything that you could have done to prevent it? I mean, I say to most people, it's like a sprout coming out of the soil. A seed is already there. And you can't stop how things make you feel, because they have been conditioned by the past. But you can use mindful awareness to help prevent you from reacting further down the domino stream. But then the trick question is, it's actually both. In the moment, there's nothing you can do. But time after time, if you resist and you self-discipline and you renounce your reactivity, then over time, your perceptions are impacted by those virtues. Let's call them virtues: restraint, self-restraint. Working differently with your internal world has a long-term benefit of maybe one day cleansing or clearing your perceptual distortion, so that it's possible that somebody's nasty email doesn't impact you adversely. I mean, it is true that you can receive an email and say, oh, what's wrong with that person? And just laugh it off, like they must be having a hard day, nothing to do with me, and you're kind of kosher about it. That is a possibility. But how did that happen? Did it happen randomly, or is it by way of a process of laying down the domino effect, consciously reconstructing yourself? So I think that's a really, I think that it's both. It's both. In the moment, there's nothing you can do and you have to restrain yourself, but enough restraint over time may begin to impact your initial urge. And so I think that's both the short-term and maybe the long-term perspective on a karma teaching.
Right. And I love the way that it really does. I mean, I've seen you give that little mini teaching on karma that's just like intention, action, result. And and it kind of goes like that. And yeah, I mean, just the way that that our view gets reshaped over time, I guess, feels really powerful to me.
Has there been something recently for you, Heather? Any place where this little teaching gets adapted, maybe with the kids or with your students?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think working with middle school students has been a real place where I've had to go back to my middle school self in a lot of ways, which has been a really interesting place. I mean, a lot of people are like, wow, if there's definitely a place I don't want to visit, it's my middle school self. And just seeing what that strategy looked like in middle school, which for me was like, let's just shut down, and sort of being almost like slammed like a racquetball against the wall over and over again. Like I was given the option last year when it got really dicey, when those kids really went full middle school on me, to leave, to do the thing that I'd always done, which was check out. And I remember thinking, oh no, that's what I've always done. I'm not going to check out. I'm just going to have to be in that really painful, uncomfortable space with them. And one of the things that I learned to do was to not try to teach them, because what I realized was when I was teaching them, I wasn't actually being with them. And so it really took actually being there with them and just kind of doing something like an activity where we could just be together and something would arise, like that wisdom, like the clouds would lift enough for the tiniest bit of wisdom mind to come out. But it couldn't be something that I had manufactured. It had to arise in the space. And then I could tell that those kids, their wisdom mind would recognize it and be like, oh yeah, that's true. And it would just be for a second, and then they'd go back to just being like, when's lunch and, whatever. But those moments, I felt really, really deeply. And I just was like, wow, I just healed a little bit of my middle school, my inner eighth grader.
Yeah. I mean, and I think most people can relate to that. So you're talking about a very habituated, instinctual response of cutting and running when you feel shamed or injured or hurt or rejected. They come knee jerk, and that knee jerk colors your perception. So in another moment, it's like there's nowhere to run and there's nowhere to hide. But then some point of courage and wisdom allows you to stay in the hot pocket, I call. You're in, it doesn't feel good, right? It doesn't feel good, but you make a concerted effort to say, like, whatever I'm threatened by, whatever I'm challenged by is mostly coming from my past, is mostly conditioned. It's not like the kids are really going to be a threat to you, but it feels that way. It's feeling that way.
Yeah.
So but you've been able to tolerate that feeling long enough to calculate a different kind of response. And your response is, well, let me throw out, the teacher role and let me just relate to them. First of all, let me stay amazing. But then let me try something new. So you're blazing a new pathway in your nervous system. Well, you do that once, you do that thrice, you do that multiple times. What's the long-term ramification of staying in the pocket, being willing to be flexible, throwing out all the rule books, being spontaneous with the kids? Actually, these kids that were once threatening to you are now, allies and teachers and friends, and you have now a restored sense of harmony with them. Well, that's not going to just disappear. That is making an impression on you for the next time that you possibly want to leave. It's now reinforcing itself in a positive spin or a positive direction. And it's our hypothesis that one day those kinds of situations may not fire as a kind of threat response, but just a, a natural acceptance for the human condition, that kids get wild and rambunctious, and they can be, dysregulated, and they can say nasty things, but we can tolerate them and it's not personal.
Right.
So that's, I think, like what's happening in a very real, practical example.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you. This is wonderful.
I've enjoyed this. I hope we can do it again, Heather. Let's do it again next week.
Let's do it. Yeah. Maybe we can talk about how this all applies to meditation.
Awesome. I'll see you then.
Thank you.
Okay.